I need to get this out because what's happening right now is so insane. I can barely process it, but let me back up and give you the full picture of how we got here. I'm 35 now. When I was 30, I was delivering pizzas in our hometown, living in a cramped studio apartment, trying to figure out what the hell I was doing with my life. Not my proudest moment, I'll admit that. But I wasn't hurting anyone. I was paying my bills, and I thought my family would at least have some basic human decency about it. I was wrong. The barbecue happened in July 5 years ago at my parents' house. Dad had invited the whole family over, Mom, my older brother Deacon, my uncle Jet, my cousin Micah. Standard summer gathering, burgers and beer, nothing fancy. I showed up after my shift still wearing my pizza delivery uniform because I didn't have time to change. That was my first mistake. Dad took one look at me walking into the backyard and announced to everyone that I should stay away from the grill because everything I touch turns to ash. Just said it loud enough for the neighbors to hear. Mom was standing right there with her wine glass and she started laughing. Said 30 years old and still delivering pizzas. What a waste of oxygen. I tried to laugh it off, just brush it aside. But Uncle Jet jumped in and said he wouldn't hire me to clean toilets. Micah, my cousin who's 2 years younger than me, decided to pile on and said at least the family dog accomplished something because it learned to sit. Then Deacon, my own brother, raised his beer bottle and made a toast. He said to natural selection and how sometimes it takes too long. They all howled with laughter, all of them, standing in a circle in my parents' backyard, laughing at me like I was some kind of failed experiment they were embarrassed to be related to. I didn't cry, I didn't yell, I didn't throw anything or storm off dramatically. I just stood there and took it, because that's what I'd been doing my whole life with them. I finished grilling their burgers, told them to enjoy their meal, and I left. Drove back to my apartment and sat there thinking about every single moment of that barbecue, replaying every word, every laugh, every look on their faces. Here's what you need to understand about my family. Dad owns a small construction business. Nothing huge, but it pays well. Mom never worked, just spent Dad's money on whatever she wanted. Deacon works for Dad, makes decent money, acts like he's some kind of business genius because he manages the crew schedules. Uncle Jet is Dad's brother, works in the business too. Always acted like he was Dad's right-hand man. Micah is Jet's kid, works part-time for Dad while he was supposedly figuring out his life, though he spent most of his time partying and living off his parents. They all looked down on me because I left town after high school, tried to make it on my own in the city, failed at a couple of businesses, came back broke. To them, I was the family embarrassment, the guy who couldn't hack it, the loser who had to come crawling back to deliver pizzas in the town where everyone knew him. What they didn't know was that I wasn't just delivering pizzas. I was studying, learning, planning. See, when you deliver pizzas, you meet a lot of people. You see a lot of houses. You learn about neighborhoods, property values, who's buying, who's selling, who's desperate. I started paying attention, started reading everything I could about real estate, property management, investment strategies. I saved every dollar I could, lived on basically nothing, and I waited. 2 years after that barbecue, I had enough saved to make my first property purchase, a small duplex in a neighborhood that was just starting to turn around. I fixed it up myself, rented it out, used that income to save more, bought another property 6 months later, then another. I was working 80-hour weeks between deliveries and renovations, but I didn't care because every property I bought was another step in a plan I'd been building since the day they laughed at me. I never told my family any of this, never posted about it on social media, never mentioned it when Mom called occasionally to ask when I was going to get a real job. I just kept my head down and kept building. 3 years after the barbecue, I owned 6 rental properties. I quit delivering pizzas and started managing my properties full-time. The income was more than Dad made from his construction business, but I lived in the same small apartment, drove the same old car, kept everything quiet. I didn't want them to know. Not yet. 4 years after the barbecue, I found out something interesting. Dad's business was struggling. Not failing, but definitely struggling. The construction market had shifted. Bigger companies were undercutting his bids, and his crew wasn't as efficient as it used to be. I found this out because one of my tenants worked in commercial lending and mentioned it in passing. Said Dad had applied for a business loan and was denied. I started paying closer attention after that, started asking questions carefully to people who would know. Turns out Dad had made some bad decisions, taken on projects that lost money, and the business was hemorrhaging cash. He was too proud to admit it to anyone, kept acting like everything was fine, but the numbers didn't lie. That's when I started buying property in specific areas where Dad had contracts, areas where his business needed to operate. I wasn't trying to sabotage him directly. I was just making strategic investments. If some of those investments happened to make his operations more difficult, well, that was just business. 5 years after the barbecue, so about 2 months ago, things started getting interesting. Dad's business was in real trouble. He'd lost several major contracts. His crew had shrunk because he couldn't afford to keep everyone on, and Deacon was starting to panic because he realized the family money train might be derailing. Mom called me for the first time in 8 months, asked how I was doing, small talk, then casually mentioned that Dad was having some business troubles and did I know anyone who might want to invest or partner up? I told her I was still just trying to figure out my own life, and I'd let her know if I heard of anyone. She sounded disappointed, but didn't push it. A week later, Deacon called, said Dad needed help with some property issues. Something about permits and zoning, and did I know anything about that kind of thing? I told him I didn't. Wished him luck, and hung up. He called back 3 more times that week, and I let it go to voicemail. Then Uncle Jet showed up at my apartment. I don't know how he got my address since I'd moved twice since the barbecue and never told anyone in my family where I lived. He knocked on my door on a Thursday evening, stood there looking uncomfortable, and asked if we could talk. I told him I was busy and started to close the door, but he put his hand on it and said it was important. About Dad, about the family. I let him in. He sat on my couch and spent 20 minutes dancing around the real issue before finally admitting that Dad's business was about to go under unless something changed. They needed capital. They needed connections. They needed someone who understood real estate and property management because that's where their biggest problems were. He said Dad was too proud to ask, but the whole family was counting on the business staying afloat. I asked him why he was telling me this. He said because I was family, and family helps family. I just looked at him and asked if he remembered that barbecue 5 years ago. He got quiet for a minute, then said everyone says things they don't mean when they're drinking and having fun, that I was being too sensitive about some jokes. I told him to leave. He tried to argue, said I was really going to let pride destroy the family, and I opened the door and repeated myself. He left, but not before saying that Dad knew about my properties, knew I'd done well for myself somehow, and that I should think about what kind of man holds grudges against his own father. That was 3 weeks ago. Since then, Mom has called 6 times. Deacon has shown up at 2 of my properties trying to catch me during inspections. Micah sent me a long message on Instagram asking if we could meet up and talk about old times. Even Dad called, which he hasn't done in probably 7 years, left a voicemail saying we should have dinner sometime soon. His treat, catch up on things. I haven't responded to any of them. I've been watching from a distance as Dad's business continues to decline. 2 more crew members quit last week. A major client pulled a contract yesterday. The business has maybe 3 months before it's completely dead, and with it goes their house because Dad took out a second mortgage to try to save everything, goes their cars, goes their entire lifestyle. Here's what they don't know yet. 3 of the properties I own are in locations where Dad desperately needs to build to fulfill his remaining contracts. The zoning permits he's been fighting for the last 6 months are tied up because I've filed formal objections through a property management company they don't know I own. The commercial lending company that denied his loan application is one I have a consulting relationship with, and while I didn't directly influence their decision, I certainly didn't put in a good word when they asked me about local construction companies. I'm not sabotaging them with anything illegal. I'm just strategically positioned in ways that make their problems harder to solve, and I've spent 5 years making sure I'd be in this exact position when they finally realized they needed something from me. Yesterday, Mom showed up at my apartment. I don't know how she found me, but she was standing at my door when I got home from a property inspection. She looked older than I remembered, tired, and when she saw me, she started talking fast about how Dad was having health problems from the stress, how the doctor said his blood pressure was dangerously high, how they might lose the house they lived in for 30 years. She said they needed my help. She said I'd obviously done well for myself and family, should support each other in hard times. She said Dad was sorry about things he'd said, that everyone was sorry, that it was years ago and couldn't we just move past it? I asked her what specifically Dad was sorry for. She said for anything that upset me, for jokes that went too far, for not being more supportive of my choices. I asked her if she remembered calling me a waste of oxygen. She got quiet and said she didn't remember saying that exactly. Maybe something was taken out of context. People say things when they're drinking. I told her I remembered it perfectly. Told her I remembered every single word from that barbecue. Told her I remembered how it felt to stand there while my entire family competed to see who could humiliate me the most effectively. She started crying and said I was being cruel, that holding on to anger for 5 years was unhealthy, that I was letting bitterness turn me into someone I wasn't. I asked her to leave. She didn't move at first, just kept crying and saying they needed me, that I was the only one who could help them. That didn't I care about my own family? I told her that my family made it very clear 5 years ago exactly how much they cared about me, and now they could figure things out on their own the same way I had to. She left, but not before saying that Dad would call me himself, that he would apologize properly, that I just needed to give them a chance to make things right. I closed the door and stood there thinking about how desperate she looked, how different from the woman laughing in the backyard with her wine glass. This morning, I got a text from Deacon. Said we needed to talk immediately, that this was serious, that people's lives were at stake. I didn't respond. An hour later, I got another text saying he knew I owned properties, knew I had money and connections, knew I was deliberately making things harder for Dad's business. He said I was destroying the family out of spite and that I should be ashamed of myself. I still didn't respond. Then this afternoon, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. I answered and it was Micah, crying, saying his dad might lose his job when Dad's business folds, that they could lose their house too since they'd borrowed money from Dad that they can't pay back. He said I was his cousin. Didn't that mean anything? Couldn't I help them just this once? I hung up. 5 minutes later, my phone started blowing up with messages from all of them. Mom saying I was breaking her heart. Deacon saying I was proving I was exactly the failure they always thought I was. Uncle Jet saying I was spiteful and cruel. Micah saying he never thought I'd be the type of person to watch families suffer. Not a single one of them has actually apologized for what they said at that barbecue. Not one of them has acknowledged what they did was wrong, beyond Mom's vague, sorry if you were upset non-apology. They're all just desperate and angry that I'm not saving them. And you know what the craziest part is? I'm not even done yet. This is just the beginning of what I've been planning for 5 years. They think their problems are bad now, but they have no idea how much worse things are about to get. I've been patient, methodical, strategic, and now everything is finally falling into place exactly the way I designed it. They laughed at me while I stood in their backyard in my pizza delivery uniform. They made jokes about natural selection while I grilled their food. They treated me like I was worthless, like I was an embarrassment, like I was something to be mocked and dismissed. Now they're the ones begging, and I haven't even started applying the real pressure yet. Update 1. Thank you to everyone who took the time to read and comment. Some of you said I should just walk away and let them implode on their own. Others said I should take everything from them. And honestly, both camps have valid points. But here's the thing, Corey. I've been planning this for 5 years, and I'm not about to just walk away now when things are getting interesting. So let me tell you what's happened since my last post, because it's been a wild 3 weeks. The day after I posted, Dad finally showed up at my apartment himself. It was a Saturday morning and I was getting ready to meet with a contractor when I heard someone pounding on my door. Not knocking, pounding. I opened it, and there he stood, red-faced and sweating even though it was only 9 in the morning. He pushed past me into my apartment without asking, looked around at my basic furniture and small space, and asked how I could live like this when I apparently had all this money. I told him where I lived was none of his business and asked what he wanted. He spent 10 minutes explaining how the construction business was going through a rough patch, how the market was tough, how bigger companies were playing dirty to steal his contracts. Never once mentioned anything about his own decisions or management. It was all external forces conspiring against him according to his version of events. Then he got to the point. He knew I owned multiple properties. He'd done some digging and found out I had connections in real estate and property management. And he needed my help with permits and zoning issues that were blocking his current projects. He said if I could just make a few calls, pull a few strings, maybe invest some capital in the business, we could turn everything around and I'd get a good return on my investment. I asked him why he thought I'd help him. He looked genuinely confused by the question. Said because I was his son, and that's what sons do for their fathers. I asked him if he remembered what he said to me at that barbecue 5 years ago. He waved his hand dismissively and said everyone makes jokes, that I was being too sensitive about some comments from years ago, that I needed to grow thicker skin. I told him those weren't jokes. He said they were, that everyone was just having fun. And I took it personally because I was insecure about my situation at the time. He said if I was really doing as well as everyone claimed, then I should be over it by now. That successful people don't hold grudges over stupid remarks. I asked him if he would apologize. He said apologize for what exactly? For joking around at a family gathering. I said for calling me a loser who turns everything to ash. He said he never used the word loser, that I was remembering it wrong, that he just made a comment about the grill. I asked about Mom saying I was a waste of oxygen. He said Mom never said that I was exaggerating or making things up to justify holding a grudge. I actually laughed at that point because the audacity was incredible. He started getting angry and said I was being childish, that I was letting my ego destroy the family over nothing. I told him that if it was nothing, then he wouldn't be standing in my apartment begging for help. Then he changed tactics, started talking about how Mom was worried sick, how the stress was affecting her health, how Deacon had a wife and kid who depended on Dad's business staying solvent. He said Uncle Jet and Micah were family too, that their financial problems would hurt a lot of people, that I had the power to prevent that suffering and was choosing not to out of spite. I told him that 5 years ago I was struggling and nobody in this family lifted a finger to help me. He said that was different, that I was an adult who made my own choices to leave town and try to make it on my own, that I couldn't expect handouts just because things got hard. I asked how this situation was any different. He said because this was about the whole family's livelihood, not just one person's poor decisions. The conversation went in circles like that for another 20 minutes. Every time I brought up specific things that were said at that barbecue, he either denied they happened, claimed I was misremembering, or insisted they were just jokes that I took too seriously. Finally, I told him I had somewhere to be and he needed to leave. He said we weren't done talking, and I said yes we were. He left, but not before saying I'd regret this. That family is forever, and I was throwing that away. Over the next week, Deacon started showing up at my properties during the day when he knew I'd be there. The first time was at a duplex I was renovating in the north part of town. I was meeting with my contractor going over tile options when Deacon walked onto the property like he owned it. He asked to talk privately, and I told him whatever he had to say could be said in front of my contractor. He looked uncomfortable, but started anyway. He said I was destroying Dad's business on purpose, that I had deliberately positioned myself to block the permits Dad needed, that I was using my real estate connections to sabotage their contracts. I asked him how he figured that. He said it was too convenient, that my properties just happened to be in exactly the locations where Dad needed to build, that the zoning objections filed against Dad's permits came from a company that had to be connected to me. I told him he was giving me way too much credit, that I bought properties where the investment made sense and filed objections where projects would negatively impact my property values. He said I was lying and everyone knew it. I asked if he had any proof of these accusations. He didn't answer that, just said I knew what I was doing, and I should stop playing dumb. I told him that even if I was somehow involved in his problems, which I wasn't admitting to, why would that be my responsibility to fix? He said because Dad gave me opportunities growing up, paid for my education, gave me a place to live when I needed it. I reminded him that I paid my own way through community college and moved out at 18 because the environment at home was toxic. He said I was rewriting history to make myself the victim, when really I just couldn't handle normal family dynamics. I asked my contractor if we could finish later, and after he left, I asked Deacon what he really wanted. He said he wanted me to pull my zoning objections, put in a good word with whatever lending contacts I had, and maybe invest $50,000 in Dad's business to help with cash flow. In exchange, they'd cut me in as a partial owner, and I'd get returns when things turned around. I asked why I'd invest $50,000 in a failing business. He said it wasn't failing. It was just going through a tough period, and with proper capital injection, it would be profitable again. I asked to see the business financials. He said he didn't have them with him. I said then we had nothing to discuss. He got angry and said I was being unreasonable, that I was demanding impossible conditions just to avoid helping. I told him that asking to see financials before investing money wasn't unreasonable. It was basic due diligence. He said I didn't trust my own family, and that was the real problem. I asked him point blank if he remembered that barbecue 5 years ago. He said of course he remembered. It was just a normal family gathering. I asked if he remembered toasting to natural selection, while everyone laughed at me. He was quiet for a second, then said he was drinking and it was a joke, that everyone makes jokes when they're drinking, that I was taking it way too seriously. I told him that wasn't an apology. He said he wasn't going to apologize for making a joke 5 years ago, that it was ridiculous to expect that. I told him to get off my property. He said I was proving I was exactly what they said I was at that barbecue. I repeated myself and he left. 3 days later, Deacon brought Micah with him to another property. They cornered me in the driveway, and Micah did most of the talking. He said his dad was about to lose his job, that he couldn't afford his rent without help from his parents, that this was affecting his whole life. I asked how that was my problem. He said because I could fix it if I wanted to, but I was choosing not to. I asked what specifically he thought I should do. He said invest in Dad's business, help with the permit issues, use my connections to get Dad new contracts. Deacon jumped in and said they knew I was behind the permit denials, that they'd traced the objections back to a property management company and found out I was listed as a consultant. I asked how they got that information. Deacon said they had ways of finding things out, just like I had ways of blocking their permits. I told them both that even if I was somehow involved, which again I wasn't confirming, they still hadn't explained why I owed them anything. Micah said because we were family, and families don't let each other fail. I asked where that family loyalty was when they were all competing to see who could humiliate me most effectively 5 years ago. Micah said he was sorry if I felt bad about jokes from years ago, that he didn't mean anything by it. I asked if he remembered comparing me to the family dog. He said that was a joke and he was sorry I took it the wrong way. I told him that wasn't actually an apology for what he said, just an apology that I reacted to it. He got frustrated and said he didn't know what I wanted from him. I said I wanted him to acknowledge that what he said was cruel and hurtful, not just dismiss it as a joke I misunderstood. He said fine. It was cruel and hurtful. Now would I help them? I asked if he meant that or if he was just saying what I wanted to hear so I'd give them money. He didn't answer. Mom started calling multiple times a day. Uncle Jet left long voicemails about family responsibilities and forgiveness. Then, 2 weeks ago, I got a message from a woman named Mary who I'd never heard of before. She said she was Deacon's wife and asked if we could talk. I agreed to meet her at a diner on the other side of town. Mary turned out to be younger than I expected, probably late 20s, and she looked exhausted. She said she knew this was awkward, but she needed to understand what was happening with the family. I asked what Deacon had told her. She said he told her I was deliberately sabotaging Dad's business because of old grudges. I asked if she wanted my version. She said that's why she was there. So I told her about the barbecue. Every detail, every comment, every laugh. I told her about 5 years of planning and building and positioning myself exactly where I needed to be. She was quiet for a long time after I finished. Then she said Deacon never mentioned any barbecue. Never said anything about the family treating me badly. I asked if that seemed like relevant information he should have shared. She said it did completely. Then she said something that caught me off guard. She said Deacon had been talking about borrowing money from her parents to invest in Dad's business. Her parents weren't wealthy, but they had some savings, and Deacon thought $30,000 might help turn things around. I told her not to let them borrow money from her parents. She asked why not. I said because the business was going to fail regardless of whether they got $30,000, that throwing her parents' retirement savings into that mess would just mean more people getting hurt. She asked if I was really not going to help at all. I said I wasn't going to enable their continued pattern of making bad decisions and expecting other people to fix the consequences. Mary left after that, but 2 days later I got an angry text from Deacon saying I was trying to turn his wife against him, that I was deliberately trying to destroy his marriage along with everything else. Last week, Mom showed up at another property with Aunt Jasmine, Uncle Jet's wife. They must have been watching my schedule because they arrived right as I was finishing a property inspection. Mom said they were there to appeal to whatever decency I had left. Jasmine said my actions were affecting more than just the people who were at that barbecue, that she and Mary and others who had nothing to do with old conflicts were suffering too. I asked Jasmine if she knew what her husband said to me 5 years ago. She said Jet mentioned there was some disagreement at a family gathering, but he didn't go into details. I told her those details, word for word. Mom jumped in and said we all say things we don't mean sometimes. That family means forgiving those moments and moving forward. I asked why forgiveness only worked in one direction. She said she was sorry for any pain I felt from that day. I told her that was the same non-apology she gave me before, that apologizing for my feelings wasn't the same as apologizing for her actions. Jasmine tried a different approach. She said that regardless of what happened in the past, right now people were suffering, and I had the power to help. She said her son Micah was talking about dropping out of college because they couldn't afford tuition anymore. She said they might lose their house. I asked if she thought my feelings didn't matter because I was doing okay financially now. She said that wasn't what she meant, but that I should consider the bigger picture. I told her the bigger picture was that this family had a pattern of treating me like I was worthless until they needed something from me. Mom started crying and said I'd become cold and heartless. That money had changed me into someone unrecognizable. I told her that money didn't change me. It just gave me the option to say no to people who treated me terribly. 2 days ago, my contractor called and said someone had been asking around about me, trying to find out what properties I owned and what my financial situation really was. He said it was some guy claiming to be my brother, and the questions felt intrusive enough that he thought I should know. Yesterday, Deacon sent me a long text laying out everything he claimed to have discovered about my business dealings. He said he knew I filed the zoning objections, knew I had consulting relationships with companies that denied Dad loans, knew I'd been systematically positioning myself to hurt their business. He said if I didn't start cooperating, they were going to make things difficult for me. When I asked what that meant, he said they'd find ways to tie up my permits, cause problems with my tenants, make my life as difficult as I was making theirs. I told him to do whatever he thought he needed to do. This morning I woke up to find that someone had left flyers at 3 of my rental properties. The flyers told tenants that their landlord was involved in a family dispute and might not be able to properly maintain the properties soon. It included a phone number for a tenant rights organization. I know it was them. I don't have proof, but I know. And honestly, this is exactly what I expected. They're getting desperate, and desperate people do stupid things. What they don't realize is that I've been preparing for this escalation for years. The real pressure hasn't even started yet, and they're already falling apart. Update 2. All right, buckle up, because things have gotten absolutely wild in the past 2 weeks. Shout out to everyone who said my family would escalate when they got desperate. You were absolutely right. And honestly, I should have prepared better for just how unhinged they'd get. So after those flyers showed up at my rental properties, I had to do damage control with my tenants. Spent an entire day visiting each property, explaining that yes, there was a family dispute, but no, it wouldn't affect their housing or maintenance. Showing them documentation that their leases were solid, and I had plenty of reserves to handle any issues. Most of them were understanding, but one couple at the duplex on Maple Street said they'd already contacted that tenant rights organization and were considering breaking their lease early. I had my property manager send a formal letter to all my tenants reassuring them and offering a $50 rent credit for the inconvenience of dealing with the flyers. Cost me money, but it was necessary to maintain those relationships. And the whole time, I'm thinking about how this was exactly the kind of stupid, desperate move I expected from them. That same day, I got a call from the city zoning office. The woman on the phone said there had been complaints filed against several of my properties claiming I was operating them illegally, that I didn't have proper rental permits, that I was violating occupancy codes. She said they needed to schedule inspections for all 6 properties within the next 2 weeks. I knew immediately this was Deacon or Dad, or both of them trying to tie me up in bureaucratic nonsense. The thing is, all my properties are completely up to code because I'm not an idiot. I scheduled the inspections, gathered all my documentation, and prepared for them to waste the city's time finding nothing wrong. But it was still hours of my life I had to spend dealing with their petty retaliation. 3 days later, Dad showed up at my apartment again. This time, he didn't pound on the door. He knocked normally, and when I opened it, he looked different, tired, older. He asked if he could come in and talk. I almost said no, but I was curious about what new approach he'd try, so I let him in. He sat on my couch and didn't say anything for a minute. Then he started talking about how he built his construction business from nothing, how he worked 70-hour weeks for years to provide for his family, how everything he did was to give his kids a better life than he had. He said he was proud of what he'd accomplished, and he thought his sons would want to be part of that legacy. I asked where this was going. He said he was trying to understand why I hated him so much that I'd destroy everything he built. I told him I didn't hate him. I just didn't respect him, and I wasn't interested in saving him from his own failures. He said those were the same thing. I said they weren't. That hate requires caring, and I'd stopped caring about his opinion of me 5 years ago. He asked what it would take for me to help. I asked what he was offering. He said he'd make me a full partner in the business, 50% ownership, equal say in all decisions. I asked why I'd want ownership in a failing business. He said it wasn't failing. It just needed temporary support to get through a rough period. I told him I'd consider it if he'd do 3 things. First, acknowledge specifically what was said at that barbecue and admit it was wrong. Second, apologize to me in front of the entire family the same way he humiliated me in front of the entire family. Third, show me the business financials so I could assess whether it was even worth saving. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said he couldn't do the second thing because it would make him look weak in front of everyone and he'd lose their respect. I told him that was exactly how I felt 5 years ago. He said that was different because he was the head of the family and had to maintain authority. I asked if maintaining authority was more important than saving his business. He didn't answer. Then he tried a different angle, said that even if he couldn't apologize publicly, couldn't we work together for the good of the family? I asked which family members specifically I should care about. He listed off Mom, Deacon, Uncle Jet, Micah. I asked if he noticed anything about that list. He looked confused. I said they were all the people who participated in humiliating me and now expected me to save them. He said I was being petty and vindictive. I said I was being consistent. He asked what that meant. I told him that he taught me actions have consequences, that failure isn't acceptable, that weakness gets mocked. I said I learned those lessons well and now I was applying them. He stood up and said I'd turned into someone he didn't recognize. I told him he never knew me in the first place because he never bothered to pay attention. He left without another word. The next day, Mary, Deacon's wife, called me. She said Deacon didn't know she was reaching out and I shouldn't tell him. She said things at their house were getting bad, that Deacon was angry all the time, that he'd started drinking more, that he was taking his stress out on her and their kid. She said she didn't know what to do. I asked why she was telling me this. She said because I seemed like the only person in this family who was thinking clearly and she needed advice. I told her she should probably leave if Deacon was becoming aggressive. She said she couldn't afford to leave, that they were barely making rent as it was, that her income alone wouldn't support her and their daughter. I asked if Deacon had hit her. She said no, but he'd punched walls and thrown things, and she was scared it was heading that direction. I told her to document everything, keep records, have an exit plan ready. She asked if I would talk to Deacon. I said talking to Deacon wouldn't help because his problems were bigger than anything I could fix with a conversation. She got quiet, then asked if I was really not going to help at all with Dad's business. I said no. She asked what would happen to them when the business failed. I said they'd have to figure it out the same way everyone figures things out when their income disappears. She said that was cold. I said it was realistic. She thanked me for being honest at least, and hung up. I sat there thinking about how the ripples from this were spreading further than I'd initially planned, how Mary and her kid were collateral damage in something that had nothing to do with them. For about 5 minutes, I considered whether I was taking this too far. Then I remembered standing in that backyard listening to my entire family laugh at me, and the consideration passed. A week ago, Uncle Jet showed up at one of my properties with Micah. They waited until I was alone doing a walkthrough after a tenant moved out. Jet did most of the talking, and he was angry in a way I hadn't seen before. He said I was a vindictive little punk who thought he was smarter than everyone else. He said I'd always been a screw-up who couldn't handle real work, and now I was hiding behind rental properties acting like I was successful. I asked if he was done. He said he was just getting started, that I needed to hear some hard truths about myself. He said the reason everyone made jokes at that barbecue was because I was an easy target, that I'd always been soft and oversensitive, that I couldn't take criticism without running away and sulking. Micah jumped in and said they were trying to toughen me up back then, that the jokes were meant to motivate me to do better with my life. I asked if calling me a waste of oxygen was motivational. Micah said it was tough love. I asked how comparing me to a dog was loving in any way. He said I was twisting everything to make myself the victim. Jet said the real problem was that I'd always thought I was better than the rest of the family, that I looked down on them for doing honest construction work while I tried to make it big in the city. He said when I came back broke and delivering pizzas, it was satisfying to see me taken down a peg. I asked if he understood what he'd just admitted. He said he admitted nothing, that I was putting words in his mouth. I told them both to leave my property. Jet said they weren't leaving until we settled this. I pulled out my phone and said I'd call the police for trespassing. Micah said I wouldn't actually do that. I started dialing. They left, but Jet said this wasn't over, that I'd regret making enemies out of family. 2 days after that, Mom showed up at my apartment with a different approach. She brought a photo album from when I was a kid, sat on my couch and started going through it, pointing out pictures of family vacations and birthdays and holidays. She said we used to be so close, that I was such a happy kid, that somewhere along the way we lost that connection. I asked what she wanted. She said she wanted her son back. I told her that son died in a backyard 5 years ago while his family competed to see who could degrade him most effectively. She said I was being dramatic. I said she was being manipulative using old photos to try to guilt me into ignoring how she treated me. She started crying and said she didn't raise me to be this hard. I told her she didn't raise me to be much of anything because she was too busy spending Dad's money and looking down on anyone who didn't meet her standards. She said that was unfair and hurtful. I asked if it was less fair and hurtful than calling me a waste of oxygen. She closed the photo album and said fine. She was sorry she said that. It was mean, and she regretted it. I asked if she regretted saying it or regretted that it was preventing her from getting what she wanted now. She said both, that she genuinely felt bad, but also yes, she needed my help. I told her at least she was being honest finally. She asked what it would cost to buy my forgiveness. I told her forgiveness wasn't for sale, but if the family wanted my help with the business situation, there would be conditions. She asked what conditions. I said first they'd all have to admit publicly what they said at that barbecue was wrong, not vague apologies, but specific acknowledgement of their actions. Second, Dad would have to give me complete control of the business restructuring with no interference. Third, they'd all have to accept that our family relationships were permanently changed and stop pretending we could go back to how things were. She said those conditions were too harsh. I said then they were free to solve their problems without me. She asked if I really wanted to watch my family lose everything. I said I wanted them to experience consequences for their choices the same way I had to experience consequences for mine. Mom left, and I haven't heard from her since. But the harassment didn't stop. Someone, probably Deacon based on the writing style, created a fake social media account and started posting things about me being a slumlord who exploited tenants. Posted my property's addresses and encouraged people to report me to various city agencies. I had to spend hours documenting that it was all false and getting the accounts taken down. Then 3 days ago, something changed. My property manager called and said one of my tenants at the Maple Street duplex had their car keyed in the parking lot. Security footage showed 2 guys in hoodies doing it at night, but their faces weren't visible. The tenant was upset and considering moving out early despite the lease. I drove over there and looked at the footage myself. Couldn't make out faces, but something about the body language seemed familiar. I ended up paying for the tenant's car repair out of my own pocket and offering them 2 months free rent if they stayed. They agreed, but said if anything else happened, they were gone. Yesterday, I got a call from Dad. He said we needed to meet in person, that things had gone too far and we needed to end this before someone got hurt. I asked what he meant by that. He said tensions were high and people were doing stupid things and it needed to stop. I asked if he was admitting his family was behind the flyers, the false reports, the social media harassment, and the vandalism. He said he wasn't admitting anything, but hypothetically, if family members were acting out, it was because they were desperate, and I was backing them into a corner. I told him that wasn't how this worked, that they didn't get to harass me and then blame me for their harassment. He said I was missing the point, that this whole situation was spiraling and somebody needed to be the adult and de-escalate. I asked why that somebody had to be me. He said because I was the one with the power to fix everything. I said he had power too, the power to take responsibility for his business failures and his family's behavior. He said I was being deliberately difficult. I said I was being consistently principled. He said fine. He'd apologize publicly if that's what it took. I asked if he meant it or if he was just saying it to manipulate me into helping. He said did it matter as long as he did it? I told him yes, it mattered because I wasn't interested in fake apologies extracted under duress. He asked what I wanted then because apparently nothing was good enough for me. I told him I wanted him to understand that what happened 5 years ago fundamentally broke my relationship with this family, and no amount of apologies or deals would fix that. I said I wasn't holding the business situation hostage for an apology. I just genuinely didn't care if his business survived, because he'd shown me he didn't care about me when I was struggling. He was quiet for a long time, then said I'd become someone cruel. I said I'd become someone who protected himself from people who hurt him. He hung up. This morning I woke up to 17 missed calls from various family members. When I finally called back, it was Mom, and she was hysterical. She said the bank had started foreclosure proceedings on their house, that they had 30 days to come up with 3 months of missed mortgage payments, or they'd lose everything. She said this was my fault, that if I'd helped when they first asked, this wouldn't be happening. I asked how their mortgage was my responsibility. She said I had the money and the connections, and I chose to watch them suffer instead. I asked if she understood that wasn't the same as causing their suffering. She said it was close enough. I told her I was sorry she was losing her house, but it wasn't my problem to solve. She screamed at me that I was a monster, that I'd destroyed my own family, that I'd regret this for the rest of my life. Then she hung up. I'm sitting here now, and I know things are about to get even worse. They have 30 days before they lose the house, and I guarantee they're going to spend those 30 days making my life hell, trying to force me to cave. And honestly, I'm ready for it. Because here's what they still don't understand. I've been ready for this exact scenario for 5 years. Final update. This is going to be my last update because everything has finally reached its conclusion. And honestly, I need to close this chapter of my life. Thank you to everyone who followed along and offered support or advice or just told me I wasn't crazy for holding on to this for 5 years. The last 3 weeks have been absolutely insane, and I need to walk you through everything that happened because some of you predicted exactly how this would go down, and you deserve to know you were right. After Mom's hysterical call about the foreclosure, things escalated in ways that were both predictable and pathetic. The 30-day clock was ticking on their house, and they spent those weeks cycling through every manipulation tactic they could think of. Dad showed up at my apartment 4 more times. Each visit had a different energy. The first time he tried to negotiate, offering me 75% ownership of the business if I'd just invest enough to save the house. I asked to see the business books again and he said he'd bring them next time, but never did. The second visit, he brought Mom, and they tried the united front approach, both of them talking about family legacy and how I was the only one who could preserve what generations had built. I pointed out that Dad started the business 30 years ago, so the generations thing was a stretch. The third time, Dad came alone and angry, said I was enjoying watching them suffer, that I got off on having power over them. I told him that wasn't true, that I didn't enjoy any of this. I just wasn't going to rescue people who treated me like garbage. He said if I didn't enjoy it, then why not help and prove I was the bigger person? I said being the bigger person was overrated and hadn't served me well in the past. The fourth visit was different. Dad sat on my couch and cried. Actually cried. Talked about how he'd worked his whole life to build something and now it was crumbling, and he didn't know how to stop it. Talked about how he'd failed as a father and as a businessman and maybe as a person. I almost felt something like sympathy until he said that despite all his failures, I was still his son. And sons don't abandon their fathers. I told him that fathers don't humiliate their sons in front of the entire family either. He said he was a different person back then, that the business stress had made him mean, that he took out his frustrations on the wrong people. I asked if that was an apology. He said it was an explanation. I told him those weren't the same thing and he needed to leave. Deacon's approach was more aggressive. He started showing up at my properties with increasing frequency, always when tenants were around, always making a scene. He'd stand in the parking lot and yell about how I was a slumlord, how I was destroying the family, how I was a coward hiding behind rental properties. My tenants started complaining about the harassment, and I had to get a formal trespass warning issued against him. That just made him angrier. He started posting on local community social media groups about me, claiming I was running illegal rental operations and exploiting low-income tenants. I had to hire a lawyer to send cease and desist letters and get the post taken down. Cost me $3,000 in legal fees, but it was necessary. Mary called me twice more during this period. The first time she said Deacon had been fired from Dad's business because there wasn't enough work to justify his salary anymore. She said he was home all day drinking and getting angrier, and she was scared. I asked if she'd started documenting things, like I suggested. She said yes, and she'd talked to a lawyer about separation. The second call, she said she'd moved out and was staying with her parents. Said Deacon had threatened to take their daughter and disappear if she tried to leave permanently. I told her to tell her lawyer about that threat immediately. She asked if this was all worth it to me, destroying Deacon's life like this. I told her I didn't destroy Deacon's life. His father's failing business and his own choices did that, and she needed to stop blaming me for other people's actions. Uncle Jet tried a different tactic. He started contacting my tenants directly, telling them I was in financial trouble and might not be able to maintain the properties or return their security deposits. 3 tenants gave notice to move out early because of it. I had to threaten legal action against Jet for tortious interference and defamation before he stopped. Micah showed up at one of my properties with Aunt Jasmine, and they tried the sympathy approach again. Jasmine talked about how Micah had to drop out of college, how they were about to lose their house, how Jet was having panic attacks about money. She said I was the only one who could help, and didn't I care about family at all. I asked Micah if he'd ever actually apologized for what he said at that barbecue. He said he'd already apologized before. I said no, he'd said he was sorry I took it the wrong way, which wasn't an apology. He got frustrated and said fine, he was sorry for comparing me to a dog. It was mean and stupid, and he regretted it. I asked if he regretted it because it was wrong or because it had consequences. He said both. I told him that at least he was being honest, but it didn't change anything. Jasmine said I was punishing Micah for something he said as a young kid who didn't know better. I pointed out that Micah was 28 at the time, not exactly a young kid. She said I was splitting hairs and being vindictive. I told her she was minimizing harm to avoid accountability. They left after that. 2 weeks into the 30-day foreclosure period, something interesting happened. I got a call from the bank handling my parents' mortgage. The loan officer said she'd been contacted by someone claiming to be me, offering to pay off the mortgage in exchange for being added to the deed. She was calling to verify this was legitimate before proceeding. I told her it absolutely was not legitimate, that someone was trying to commit fraud using my name. She thanked me for clarifying and said she'd flagged the account for fraudulent activity. I asked if she could tell me who made the call. She couldn't give me details, but said it was a male caller claiming to be me, who knew enough personal information about the mortgage that it seemed legitimate at first. I immediately knew it was Deacon. Called my lawyer and we filed a police report for attempted fraud and identity theft. The police said they'd investigate, but these cases were hard to prove without more evidence. I told them to check the phone number the bank was called from. They said they would. That incident told me how desperate things had gotten. They weren't just harassing me anymore. They were willing to commit crimes to try to force a resolution. I increased security at all my properties and started being more careful about my daily routines. With 10 days left before foreclosure, the entire family showed up at my apartment building. All of them. Dad, Mom, Deacon, Uncle Jet, Aunt Jasmine, and Micah. They congregated in the parking lot and started calling my phone, demanding I come down and talk to them. When I didn't answer, they started knocking on doors asking neighbors which apartment was mine. I called the police for trespassing and harassment. By the time the cops arrived, my family was in a full argument with building security. The police told them all to leave or face arrest. Dad tried to explain it was a family matter and they just needed to talk to me. The cops said it didn't matter. They needed to leave the property. As they were being escorted out, Mom screamed up at the building that I was killing them, that their blood would be on my hands, that I'd destroyed the family. Dad looked broken. Deacon looked furious. The rest just looked defeated. One of the cops came to my apartment afterward to take my statement. Asked if I wanted to press charges or get a restraining order. I said not yet, but I wanted everything documented in case it escalated further. He said this was clearly a messy family situation and advised me to consider whether there was any resolution possible that would de-escalate things. I told him the resolution required them accepting consequences for their own choices, and that didn't seem likely. The final week before foreclosure was quieter in terms of direct contact, but more intense in other ways. Someone left a dead rat on the doorstep of my Maple Street property. Security footage showed a person in a hoodie leaving it at 3 in the morning, but again, no clear face visible. I filed another police report. Someone slashed the tires on my car while it was parked at one of my properties. 4 brand new tires, $800 to replace. More police reports, more documentation, more evidence that my family had completely lost control. Mary called one more time. Said Deacon had been arrested for trying to break into Dad's business office after hours. Apparently, he was looking for business documents he thought would prove something. She wasn't clear what. He'd been released on bail but was facing criminal charges. She said Deacon blamed me for his arrest, because if I'd just helped, none of this would have happened. I told her that was the same logic as blaming a robbery victim for not leaving their door unlocked. 3 days before foreclosure, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. Against my better judgment, I answered. It was Dad, and he was calling from Mom's phone because I'd blocked his number. He said he needed to see me one final time before they lost everything. Said he'd come alone. Wouldn't cause any problems, just wanted to talk. I agreed to meet him at a park near my apartment. Public place, daytime, witnesses around. He showed up looking like he'd aged 10 years in the last month. We sat on a bench, and he didn't say anything for a while, just stared at the ground. Finally, he said he understood now why I wouldn't help. Said he'd spent the last few weeks thinking about that barbecue, and he remembered more than he'd admitted before. Remembered how they'd all competed to make the most cutting joke. How I'd just stood there taking it. How he'd thought it was funny at the time. He said he was ashamed of who he was that day. I asked if he was ashamed of who he was or ashamed that it had consequences. He said both. That he genuinely saw now how cruel it was, but also, yes, he wished he could undo it because look where it led. I told him that was probably the most honest thing he'd ever said to me. He asked if there was anything at all, that would make me reconsider helping. I said no. He asked why I even agreed to meet him then. I said because I wanted him to look me in the eye and understand that this wasn't about money or business or property. It was about the fundamental truth that you don't get to treat people like garbage and then expect their loyalty when you need it. He said he got that now, but it didn't change the reality that they were losing everything. I said no, it didn't change that reality. He asked what they were supposed to do. I told him the same thing he'd told me when I came back broke 5 years ago. Figure it out, adult life is hard. Can't expect handouts just because things got difficult. He actually laughed at that, bitter and broken. Said I really had learned from him after all. I said I learned exactly what he taught me, just not the lessons he intended. He stood up and said he was sorry for everything. For the barbecue, for not being a better father, for letting the family treat me the way they did. He said he knew it didn't matter now, but he wanted me to know he meant it. I told him I believed he was sorry, but sorry didn't fix anything. He nodded and walked away. That was the last time I saw him. The foreclosure went through. My parents lost the house they'd lived in for 30 years. They moved into a small rental apartment across town. The kind of place they would have made fun of other people for living in. Dad's business officially filed for bankruptcy 2 weeks later. Uncle Jet lost his job, obviously, and they had to sell their house too. Moved in with Jasmine's parents in another state. Deacon's criminal charges were reduced to a misdemeanor trespassing charge with probation. Mary filed for divorce and got primary custody of their daughter. Last I heard, Deacon was working at a warehouse making barely enough to cover his child support payments and living in his car sometimes. Micah moved back in with his parents in their rental apartment. Got a job in retail, no longer talks about going back to college. Mom stopped calling me entirely. Deacon sent one final text message calling me every name he could think of and saying he hoped I was happy destroying the family. I didn't respond. And here's the thing. I'm not happy about any of this. I'm not celebrating their suffering or feeling vindicated by their losses. What I feel is mostly just tired and empty and sad that it came to this. But I also don't regret my choices because what was the alternative? Enable them? Reward their behavior? Teach them that cruelty doesn't have consequences? Some of you in the comments said I went too far, that I should have been the bigger person. That family is family no matter what. I respect that perspective, but I disagree with it. Being family doesn't entitle you to unlimited chances to hurt someone. Being blood-related doesn't mean you get to avoid consequences for your actions. Other commenters said I didn't go far enough, that I should have actively sabotaged them instead of just refusing to help. I disagree with that too. I didn't destroy them. Their own choices destroyed them. I just declined to save them from those choices. What I did was set boundaries and stick to them. I protected myself from people who had proven they would hurt me. I refused to enable a pattern of behavior that was toxic and harmful. And yeah, watching them fall apart as a consequence of that was brutal and uncomfortable and sad. But it was also necessary. 5 years ago, I stood in a backyard while my entire family competed to humiliate me as effectively as possible. They laughed at my failures, mocked my struggles, and made it clear they viewed me as worthless. That moment changed something fundamental in how I viewed relationships and loyalty and family. Now, they've experienced their own version of that moment, spread out over months instead of minutes. They've felt what it's like to be desperate and struggling, while someone who could help just watches. They've learned that actions have consequences, and those consequences don't care about your excuses or your desperation. I don't know if they've actually learned anything or if they just blame me for everything and learned nothing. I don't know if they understand why this happened or if they still think I'm just cruel and vindictive. And honestly, I don't really care anymore. What I know is that I set boundaries, I protected myself, and I refused to enable toxic behavior. That's all I ever needed to do. So that's it. That's the whole story. My family humiliated me at a barbecue 5 years ago, and now they're paying the price for that choice. Some of you will think I'm justified, some will think I'm awful, and that's fine. You're entitled to your opinions. Me? I'm just done with all of it. Time to move forward with my life without looking back.